Okay, so are you ready to like jump into this whole thing with Trump's executive order about English being the official language?
Yeah, let's do it. I think it's a really interesting topic, and yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
Right. So like everyone listening out there wanted to know more about like what this all means. So we've got like a ton of stuff to go through. News articles, expert opinions. We even like dug into the Federal Register for the actual like text of the executive order.
Oh, wow. You went deep.
Yeah, it's a deep dive, right. But honestly, the thing that like blew my mind the most was that the US has never had an official language before, like
Yeah.
ever. Even though English was used in like all the founding documents, it's never been officially the AE language.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's always been this kind of unspoken assumption, but never codified into law.
Yeah.
So this move is definitely a pretty big shift.
Huge, right. And it makes you wonder like why now? Why after all this time is this happening? Is it just like a symbolic thing or is there something more to it?
It's a good question. I think there are a few different layers to it. We have to consider the political climate, the changing demographics of the country, and even the historical context of language policy in the U.S.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start by like breaking down what the executive order actually says. What does it actually do?
Okay, so straight from the Federal Register, the order states that English is now the official language of the United States. Pretty straightforward, right?
Okay, but what does that actually mean, like practically speaking?
Well, it also revokes Executive Order 13166, which was put in place by President Clinton and basically mandated that federal agencies provide language access for people with limited English proficiency.
Oh, so like translating documents and providing interpreters and stuff.
Exactly. So on the surface, it seems like a pretty significant change.
Yeah, it does. But then I was reading some of these articles and it seems like the actual impact might be a bit more complicated than it initially appears.
Right. You're hitting on a key point here. This order only applies to the federal government. It doesn't change existing laws protecting language rights based on national origin, like Title VI of the Civil Rights Act.
So it's not like suddenly every state and local government has to switch everything to English only.
Not at all. This order really focuses on how the federal government operates internally and how it communicates with the public.
Gotcha. But it still seems like it could have some pretty big ripple effects, right? We're talking about potentially limiting language access for millions of people who interact with the federal government.
You're absolutely right. To understand the potential consequences, we need to hear from the people who've been working on language access issues for years. We found this really interesting YouTube discussion with two experts, Carol Valendia Prado and Bill Rivers. They have pretty strong opinions about this executive order.
Oh yeah, that discussion was heated. Prado seemed really worried about the potential for discrimination against non-English speakers, particularly in like healthcare and education.
Yeah.
She said something like, it's like revoking all the roadmaps, but telling everyone they're still free to drive.
Yeah, that's a powerful analogy. It highlights the potential for confusion and danger that could arise from removing language access mandates while leaving other legal protections in place.
Right. Like imagine trying to explain a medical condition or understand complicated legal documents in a language you're not fluent in. It's already hard enough for many people to navigate these systems, and this executive order could make it even harder.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Prado argued that this could lead to an over-reliance on unqualified interpreters or even family members, which could be incredibly risky, especially in healthcare settings.
Yeah, that's a huge concern. But I also remember that Bill Rivers had a slightly different take on the situation. He seemed a bit more optimistic, or at least cautious.
Yeah, Rivers acknowledged the challenges, but emphasized that those legal protections are still in place and that many organizations already understand the value of providing language access.
So he's saying that it might not be as bad as some people fear.
He believes the impact will really depend on how different federal agencies choose to interpret and implement the order. So there's a lot of uncertainty still.
That makes sense. There's bound to be some inconsistency as different agencies figure out how to comply. But even if some agencies continue to provide language access, what about those who are already falling through the cracks? Like we've seen cases of children being used as interpreters or people being denied access to services because of language barriers.
You're raising a really important point. This executive order could exacerbate those existing inequalities and make it even harder for those who are already struggling to access services in their preferred language.
And it brings up this whole bigger question about language, culture, and national identity in the U.S. A lot of the articles framed it as a tension between inclusivity and maintaining a shared American culture.
Yeah, it's a classic debate in diverse societies.
Yeah.
How do you balance welcoming newcomers while also preserving a sense of unity? Many countries have official languages, so the U.S. has always been unique in its approach.
And it's important to remember just how diverse the U.S. already is linguistically. The census data shows that over 70 million people speak a language other than English at home, and something like 80% of children entering school without English proficiency are actually U.S. citizens or legal residents.
That's a crucial statistic. It really challenges the notion that making English the official language is about promoting assimilation or unity. These individuals are already part of the fabric of American society, and limiting their access to information and services could have some pretty far-reaching consequences.
Okay, so we've laid out the context, but now I'm really curious about the practical implications. What will this actually change on the ground for people who rely on language access services? Let's dig into that next.
All right, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How will this executive order actually affect people's lives? Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Will government services become less accessible for people who don't speak English?
Right, or could it lead to more demand for interpreters and translators?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. The research we looked at kind of shows a mixed bag.
Hmm.
Some healthcare systems, for example, have already come out and said they'll keep providing language access no matter what happens with the executive order.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Yeah, they see it as like a core part of providing equitable care.
That makes sense. But I also saw some reports that were worried about potential cuts to translation and interpretation budgets.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern.
Because, wouldn't that push organizations to rely more on AI solutions? And those still have, a long way to go, right?
Oh, absolutely. AI-powered translation tools can be helpful for some things, but relying on them solely for complex situations like medical stuff or legal stuff could be a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, can you imagine relying on an AI interpreter to convey, life-altering medical information?
It's just too risky. There are nuances in language and cultural context that AI just can't grasp yet.
Right, and what about the ethical considerations?
Exactly. And then there's the issue of access. Not everyone has the technology needed for AI-powered language services, so it could create a digital divide on top of everything else.
This whole thing feels like a tangled mess. It's not as easy as just saying everyone must speak English.
You got it. One thing that's often overlooked is that while this executive order gets rid of the big mandate for language access at the federal level, the enforcement mechanisms for language rights are still there.
So they didn't completely disappear.
No, they're just woven into other laws like the Civil Rights Act and the Affordable Care Act.
Okay, so the legal framework is still there, but it sounds like it could become more fragmented and harder to navigate.
Yeah, for sure. Navigating those legal pathways can be super complicated, especially for people who are already facing language barriers.
It's like adding another layer of bureaucracy to an already difficult process.
And realistically, how many people are actually going to be able to do that? Especially if they don't have access to lawyers or advocacy groups who can help them.
It seems like a lot of people would just give up.
It's a real possibility. That's why it's so important to have strong advocates and clear guidance from experts.
For sure. And there's another argument for investing in language access that often gets lost in all this, the economic benefits.
Oh, yeah, you're right. We touched on that earlier.
I'm really curious to hear more about that. It seems counterintuitive to some people, but I have a feeling it's a pretty strong case.
It is. Studies have shown that providing language access in healthcare, for example, can actually save money in the long run.
How so?
Well, when patients understand their diagnoses and treatment plans, they're more likely to follow their doctor's instructions.
Makes sense.
And that leads to better health outcomes, fewer complications, less need for expensive interventions down the road.
So it's not just about saving money. It's about empowering patients to be active participants in their own healthcare.
Exactly. When people feel understood and respected, they're more likely to trust their providers and follow their recommendations.
It's a win-win situation. Better communication, better care, better outcomes, and a more efficient system overall.
Right. And these economic arguments go beyond healthcare, too. Think about the impact on businesses if they can communicate effectively with a wider customer base.
Or the benefits to the education system if students from diverse backgrounds can fully participate in learning.
It's about maximizing potential and creating a more inclusive and equitable society.
It seems like investing in language access isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do.
I couldn't agree more. It's just a shame that these arguments are often overshadowed by all the political noise.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Because at its core, language access is about making sure everyone has a fair shot, regardless of their language background.
Absolutely. It's about fairness, equity, and recognizing the value of linguistic diversity.
Okay, so we've explored the possible consequences of this executive order, the legal stuff, even the economic arguments. But there's still one big question for me. Where do we go from here? What does all of this mean for the future of language access in the U.S.?
That's a tough one. We've seen how this executive order has brought up deeper fears about national identity and the role of language in a diverse society. There are valid concerns on both sides, and finding a way forward is going to require open communication and a commitment to making sure everyone has equal access.
It's definitely not a simple issue. It seems like this conversation is far from over.
Okay, so after going through all of this,
Yeah.
what do we actually think about this executive order?
Right. It's a tough one.
Some people say it's like a step back for inclusivity, and others say it's important for unity and making the government run better.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a lot more complicated than it might seem at first glance.
Going through all this research, it just seems like even with the laws we have, the right to language access isn't a guarantee for everyone.
That's true. The experts we were looking at were saying that there are still cases of children being asked to translate for their parents at the doctor,
Wow.
or people being denied services just because they don't speak English well enough.
Yeah, and that's a huge problem.
Mm.
And I think this executive order could actually make things even worse for those people who are already struggling.
Right. Like they're already facing barriers, and this could just add more.
Exactly.
Mm.
And we have to think about what this means for the people who work in language services, too.
Yeah, like all the interpreters and translators.
If funding gets cut or everyone starts relying on AI, what happens to their jobs?
It's kind of scary to think about.
It is. On the one hand, this could lead to more demand for training and consulting as organizations try to figure out how to deal with all this.
Like they need help understanding the new rules and finding ways to provide language access without breaking the bank.
Exactly. So maybe there will be more opportunities for language professionals who can help organizations navigate all of this.
Yeah, that's true. But then there's also the risk that people will lose their jobs and those really important skills will be devalued.
You're right. It's like a double-edged sword.
It makes me think about AI and how this whole thing might actually speed up the use of those technologies, even though they're not perfect yet.
That's an interesting thought. Could this push us towards a future where AI is just the default for language access?
Even with all the problems we talked about.
It's possible. I mean, it would definitely be cheaper for organizations.
But what about the accuracy and the cultural sensitivity?
And the human connection.
It's kind of unsettling to think about losing that human element in these situations.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider. It raises questions about the role of technology in our lives and how we balance efficiency with things like human interaction and understanding.
I don't know, it's a lot to process. This executive order could really change things in a lot of ways.
It definitely has the potential to trigger a ripple effect, and we might not even be able to see all the consequences yet.
Well, this has been super informative. It feels like this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It definitely has. And thanks for bringing this topic to us. I think it's an important conversation to be having.
For sure. And to everyone listening out there, thanks for sending us down this rabbit hole with you.
Yeah. We hope this has helped you understand this issue a little better and maybe given you some new things to think about.
This conversation about language access is so important. It's about fairness and equity and making sure everyone has the opportunity to fully participate in society.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep advocating for what you believe in.
Language is how we connect with each other and understand the world around us. Making sure everyone have access to it is crucial for building a society that's just and equitable for all.